how much do you want to be accepted by everybody?
Well, it's just, I think it's, you can't, I think it's what's the word? It's logical that, once if you're around, if you're successful sort of for a long period of time, that you are going to become accepted, by everybody eventually, And once they accept the fact that you're there, they don't sort of worry about it anymore. They don't,
Brian Jones, the blonde architect of the Rolling Stones, floats face down in the moon-washed pool of his Sussex estate, while blue sirens paint the garden walls. Within hours, tabloids dragged and wildly implicated estranged bandmates Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, cash-strapped builder Frank Thorogood, and Brian's girlfriend Anna Wohlin to his death. Buckle in as we strip back police files, backstage feuds, and deathbed whispers to learn whether Jones slipped under the water by mischance or was pushed down into becoming rock's darkest legend. Blue flashing police lights arrived at Cotchford Farm just before midnight on the 3rd of July 1969, turning the Sussex countryside into a scene that felt more crime novel than country retreat. Police officers, splashing through wet grass, pointed torches at the swimming pool where Brian Jones floated motionless. Water that had once reflected the moon now carried a silent body that only hours earlier belonged to the blonde peacock who founded the Rolling Stones. The official verdict, stamped on the coroner's papers, read, "Death by misadventure." Brian's inner circles immediately whispered, "Murder." Half a century later, the mystery still rumbles like a ghost amplifier, and the questions beg to be asked. How did the prodigy who gave the Stones their earliest spark end up alone in the deep end of his own pool? Let us scroll back to Cheltenham Spa in February 1942, when a tidy semi-detached house housed a baby named Louis Brian Hopkins Jones. His mother Louisa played church organ on Sundays. His father Louis directed the local choral society, and both assumed their son would follow a similar respectable path. Young Brian battled asthma, which kept him indoors for long stretches, so he mastered the clarinet as a form of breathing therapy and escapism. Teachers soon realized the boy's ears were sharper than any textbook. His grades looked promising until adolescence struck like a thunderclap. He discovered skiffle, started skipping classes, bought a saxophone with saved pennies, then sold it again to purchase his first acoustic guitar. School authorities saw a slide student when they spoke of him. Brian saw himself as a slide guitarist waiting to burst free. Even before puberty, Jones was already a one-boy orchestra. Family friends recall the 10-year-old picking out Bach inventions on the parlor piano in the morning, then switching to first clarinet chair in the school orchestra after lunch. At 14, he sold that clarinet to buy an alto saxophone, and 2 months later he reportedly could quote Charlie Parker solos note perfect, astonishing bandmates twice his age. That hunger for fresh timbre kept widening. On his 16th birthday, his father presented a 12-pound acoustic guitar. Brian stayed up 48 hours, blistering his fingers until he could replicate Elmore James's dust-raising slide lines. From then on, any new instrument, auto harp, recorder, even oboe was fair game. So long as it added color, no rival group could copy. By 17, he was already a legend in his own mind. Expelled for cutting lessons and fathering a child with a local girl, he hitched rides across northern Europe, busking blues licks on street corners. Somewhere between Paris and Oslo, the teenager stopped answering to Brian Jones and began introducing himself as Elmo Lewis, a nod to slide master Elmore James. The new alias came with a fresh attitude and a habit of fine-tuning any borrowed instrument within minutes. The continental busking run of 1961 turned theory into hard miles. Jones hitchhiked through France, Belgium, and Scandinavia with nothing but a sleeping bag and his guitar, trading Chuck Berry licks for café meals. In Paris, he teamed with Scottish folkie Whiz Jones and busked outside metro stations until the gendarmes moved them on, an experience he later called the real finishing school. He returned to London in 1962 carrying a battered suitcase, a battered acoustic, and a mission. Britain needed an authentic blues group, and he would build it. The capital's underground music magazines became his recruiting ground. One small advert in Jazz News read simply, "Need rhythm guitarists for Alexis Corner-style R&B outfit. Call Brian." A lanky Dartford art student named Mick Jagger turned up at the basement rehearsal, bringing his friend Keith Richards. They clicked on a Muddy Waters riff, and the basis for the legendary group was born. Within a week, Brian was hiring a keyboard player named Ian Stewart and a bassist named Bill Wyman. Charlie Watts, who juggled jazz gigs with graphic design work, completed the picture on drums. The new band needed an identity. At rehearsal, Brian glanced at a Tony Glover album sleeve and saw the title, Rolling Stone. He wrote those words on a scrap of paper and declared the search over. In that moment, the Rolling Stones were born. In the early days, Brian handled everything. He booked the gigs, called the van, selected the songs, even imposed a small leadership fee on top of the shared earnings. When promoters argued about money, he smoothed the deal with charm, then slapped a fine on any bandmate who turned up late. His control was not petty ego. He had a sonic vision. Brian peppered the raw blues setlist with harmonica wails, learned from Chicago records and lap steel slides that most London guitarists could not imitate. The Marquee Club residency proved his choices were right. Teenagers queued around the block, drawn by the dangerous vibe that separated the Stones from polite pop outfits in matching suits. Newspapers called Brian the heart of the new menace, blonde hair cut into a sharp bob, striped trousers clinging to narrow hips, eyes shining with restless curiosity. Television bookings unlocked a wider stage. When the Stones hit The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, many American households saw Brian first because camera operators loved his winking confidence. He rewarded them by switching instruments between verses, one moment harmonica, next a Vox teardrop guitar. In the studio, he added marimba to Under My Thumb. He even brought an Appalachian dulcimer to the studio, wrapping electric blues around folk flavor. That daring flair made the Stones more than a riff machine. It turned them into a kaleidoscope band that could pivot in any direction. Tour schedules soon grew brutal. 1993 and 94 found the group zigzagging Britain in a drafty Bedford van that smelled of petrol and stale sandwiches. Clubs were overheated, hotels underheated, and stage monitors unreliable. When an amp blew, the band cracked jokes to keep crowds entertained until the fuse was replaced. These tribulations forged an unspoken code among the 6 musicians. Never stop the show, never surrender momentum, cover each other without blinking. The crowd roared and the band believed they could conquer the world. America delivered the first real taste of hysteria. When the Stones landed at JFK on 1 June 1964, hundreds of teenagers broke through police lines, chasing the band's Cadillac convoy clear to Manhattan. Inside the Ed Sullivan Theater that October, Brian, brandishing his ice blonde bob and a Vox teardrop guitar, grinned while fans' shrieks drowned the opening of Time Is On My Side. Sullivan scolded the crowd on live TV, yet invited the group back. Ratings had surged, and Brian's image was now cemented in every U.S. teen magazine on the newsstand. That same multi-instrument mania colored 2,000 Light Years from Home, later in '67, where Jones's mellotron swoops turned a simple riff into interstellar drift. Music historians frequently cite the track as the Stones' most psychedelic cut, precisely because of the eerie string and brass patches he coaxed from that temperamental keyboard. Between court dates for cannabis possession, he sneaked in a passion project, the soundtrack to the German art house thriller, A Degree of Murder. Working at IBC and Olympic Studios, Brian played sitar, organ, recorder, banjo, bass, and dulcimer, while Jimmy Page contributed fuzz guitar. Producer Glyn Johns later called the sessions a one-man orchestra demonstration. Through all of this, the camera still loved him. Wrapped in an eye-popping orange, velvet coat, striped shirt, and a fluffy white hat, Jones glided into the Monterey Pop Festival stage in June 1967, there only as a fly-in guest. Leaning into the microphone, he introduced the Jimi Hendrix Experience as the most exciting guitar player I've ever heard, gifting rock history one of its coolest cameos. His thirst for collaboration reached even the Beatles' inner sanctum. In May 1967, he wandered into Abbey Road, picked up a borrowed Selmer tenor, and blew the woozy sax riff that opens John Lennon's avant comedy track, You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. Lennon later joked in an interview, quote, "Brian was a ropey sax player, which was exactly the sound we needed. Yet every glittering crest hides an undertow." 2 drug raids in 1967 and 1968 yanked Brian from studio bliss into courtroom anxiety. Photographs show him shaking in a velvet jacket while facing police testimony. His passport troubles meant he missed a United States tour. Meanwhile, Mick and Keith, now recognized songwriting partners, wrote Jumpin' Jack Flash without his input. Studio attendance became erratic. Sometimes Brian vanished for hours, then reappeared with new riffs that dazzled everyone. Other sessions he sat slumped, barely plucking a chord. Anxiety medication mixed with alcohol, and the result soured fast. The comradeship built on motorway whiskey and laughter began to fracture. Police zeroed in on Jones 10 May 1967, raiding his Courtfield Road flat at dawn, and seizing a small vial of cannabis resin plus a half-burned pipe. He was hauled before West London magistrates, released on £100 bail, and in October received a £1,000 fine and a 9-month suspended sentence, a judgment the Times called stiff but not vindictive. Exactly a year and 11 days later, 21 May 1968, officers struck again, this time at Cotchford Farm, finding a single cannabis joint and 2 hash-filled pipes in the music room. Because he was already on probation, prosecutors even hinted at real prison time, but the judge settled for another suspended term and £50 costs, branding Jones a mess, not a menace. Swinging London also handed him romance, and turmoil in the form of Italian-German model Anita Pallenberg. Their 2-year relationship veered from velvet-roped glamour to frightening violence as Brian's drug intake soared. Friends later confirmed she fled an abusive night in Morocco and sought refuge with Keith Richards, an escape that deepened the fracture inside the Stones. June 1969 delivered the final blow. With new guitarist Mick Taylor waiting in the wings, management summoned Brian to his own living room and explained that the band would move forward without him. Public statements referred to musical differences. Private conversations spoke of missed rehearsals, visa headaches, legal distractions, and the weight of his fragile health. Brian told a reporter, quote, "To hell with them." Then, he retreated to Cotchford Farm, a countryside manor, once owned by A. Milne, author of Winnie the Pooh. The estate featured rolling lawns, tall hedges, and a kidney-shaped pool he had recently commissioned. He hired a builder named Frank Thorogood to oversee renovations. He stocked the bar with brandy bottles, invited a small circle of friends, and tried to reclaim joy. Nights involved jamming on acoustic guitars, tinkering with Mellotron tapes, and dreaming of a supergroup featuring Jimi Hendrix and Steve Winwood. After his June '69 dismissal, he wasn't moping. He was recruiting. Alexis Corner invited him to front a blues-jazz hybrid dubbed New Church, and Jones phoned Steve Winwood and Jimi Hendrix drummer Mitch Mitchell about forming a little supergroup. Some members even stayed at Cotchford Farm to rehearse sketches that, tragically, never reached tape. Back in London that same spring, he cut one last indelible mark on a Stones record, the mournful slide guitar winding through No Expectations. Mick Jagger has said his clearest final studio memory of Jones is that session. He sat on the floor, played the part once, and it was perfect. The evening that fateful 3rd of July began like many others. Brian, his girlfriend Anna Wohlin, and friends Janet Lawson and Frank Thorogood lingered near the pool house, listening to jazz. Brian jumped into the water for a late swim. Witness recollections diverge from that moment. Some say Thorogood joined him for horseplay. Others say that they saw no roughhousing. Anna glanced away, heard a splash, then found Brian floating face down. Thorogood and Lawson, who was a nurse, pulled him out. They attempted mouth-to-mouth, but resuscitation failed. Paramedics arrived swiftly but declared life extinct on arrival. Police noted there was alcohol and barbiturates in his bloodstream, but not at lethal quantities. Coroner Dr. Angus Somerville ruled misadventure, suggesting the 27-year-old had drowned following a fainting episode brought on by the substance combination in his system that night. Conspiracy theories and paranoia immediately exploded as soon as the news broke, except money loomed behind the last argument. Builder Frank Thorogood claimed Jones still owed him several thousands of pounds, tens of thousands in today's money, for Cotchford renovations, Brian's estate, and eyewitness Janet Lawson later told police she heard the two men clash over that bill on the very afternoon Brian died. Crime Reads would sum it up decades later in one brutal sentence, quoting Thorogood, "It was me that did Brian, all over an unpaid invoice." That alleged confession sits at the heart of every modern reinvestigation. Music journalist Terry Rawlings wrote in Who Killed Christopher Robin that Stone's road manager turned fixer Tom Keylock told him Thorogood had admitted on his deathbed in July 1993 that he, quote, clobbered the lad in the pool. His funeral on 10 July 1969 drew several hundred fans to Cheltenham Cemetery. The white oak coffin, blanketed in white roses and lilies, was lowered as Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman stood shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed behind dark glasses. A local brass quartet played Just a Closer Walk with Thee, honoring the jazz roots Jones had never abandoned. Shockwaves rippled through music circles. Friends gathered at Cheltenham Cemetery where Pete Townsend read from Ecclesiastes and later wrote the elegy A Normal Day for Brian, a man who died every day. Rolling Stones fans flocked to Hyde Park 2 days later for a band event. The concert had been booked and was set to happen before the news had broken it, and it immediately became a memorial for the band's now late leader. Mick Jagger read lines from Adonis, butterflies were released, and thousands fell silent. Brian inadvertently became the founding member of what cultural commentators later dubbed the 27 Club, a roster that would soon add Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and Kurt Cobain. The idea that creative flame burns too hot and fast found its perfect case study in the blonde multi-instrumentalist who had everything but peace. Personal kindness often gets overshadowed by scandal headlines, yet those who knew Brian recall private generosity. Stories say he slipped money to roadies who struggled to pay rent, paid for hospital treatment of a club usher injured in a scuffle, and once bought round-trip tickets for a fan needing to visit a dying relative. He possessed a mercurial spirit, equal parts angel and trickster, never predictable and rarely dull. Legacy is often counted in platinum plaques, yet Brian's real treasure lies in the colors he splashed across popular music. Without his love of muddy waters, there is no Rolling Stones blueprint. Without his sitar experiment, there is no raga rock craze. The dulcimer on Lady Jane opened a door for British folk revival. His slide guitar on Little Red Rooster remains a spine-tingling lesson in tension and release. Even his wardrobe rippled outward, inspiring Carnaby Street boutiques and, decades later, revival trends in festival fashion. So we circle back to the moonlit water at Cotchford Farm. Was Brian's passing an unfortunate mixture of booze, pills, and weak lungs, or something darker? A scuffle, an unpaid debt, a push mistaken for horseplay? The case file still prompts debate. Yet behind the question stands a glittering fact. In only 7 recording years, the restless kid from Cheltenham crafted sounds that still punch life into radios. The next time Paint It Black erupts through speakers, remember the slide bar that conjured it. Remember the fingers that raced across exotic frets. And picture the grin behind the blonde fringe. That is Brian Jones in living color, forever 27, forever bending notes toward horizons no one else could see. He built the first stone from raw curiosity, handed the world a soundtrack that never ages, then vanished beneath still water that refuses to give up its secret. Perhaps that riddle is his final composition, one last unresolved chord leaving listeners leaning forward, waiting for an answer that will always hover just beyond the fade.